And after that it was easy. He found a packing case that had not been properly nailed down. It contained some kind of food, round and firm, that tasted like a bit of cheese David had once had in the camp. He cut off a piece with his knife, as big as he could get into his handkerchief. The men stopped the van while it was still dark and left it without opening the door at the back. So David jumped out and found himself in the middle of a large town, and, being careful to walk in the shadow of the houses, for there was no call to be foolhardy even if Johannes were with him, he had no difficulty finding the harbour where the ships lay. There was a water tap on the way too. David watched a man turn it on and drink, and when he had gone and the street was quiet again, David was able to walk over to it and fill his bottle. The ship he was to find needed no searching for either. It lay right in front of him, and on its stern he saw the word Italy painted in large white letters. And it was made fast to the quayside with a great thick rope, ready for David to climb up as soon as the man on watch had gone to the other end of the ship. All David needed to do was find a length of twine to tie his bundle about his waist while he was climbing. The watchman did not hear him, no one heard him, and down in the bottom of the ship there was a great dark room filled with so many packing cases that he could barely squeeze himself in. At first David was anxious to discover if there were any windows down there, but then he realised that he was now below the waterline, and so of course there weren't any. The time had now come for him to open the last of his treasures, his box of matches. He took care to shield the flame with his hands, as he had so often seen the camp guards do, and used no more than 1 or 2 matches, since he must be sparing with them. He saw case after case stacked right up to the deck above, and there were sacks as well. He found a corner where there were only a couple of sacks, and where he could stay well hidden if someone came into the hold. But that was hardly likely to happen, not before they reached Italy. The sacks and cases were all clearly bound for Italy. Just as the second match died out, David caught sight of a half-filled bottle standing on the edge of a case. He put his bundle down on the sacks, stretched on tiptoe to reach it, uncorked it and thrust his finger inside the neck. He sniffed his finger cautiously. Perhaps he could drink it. David took the bottle down and settled himself comfortably on his sacks. It would be a good thing to have if he were to be at sea for any length of time. The noise of the engines woke David, but not until the ship was well under way did he lose the strange dream-like sensation that had been with him ever since the moment in the van when he had suddenly recalled Johannes. Then he knew what had happened. Sitting bolt upright on his sack, his eyes first wide open and then closed in the darkness, he knew that Johannes was no longer with him. He had stayed behind in Salonika. David struggled with all his might against the fear that grew within him. He told himself over and over again, "He promised nothing more. He only said he would stay with me until we got to Salonika." But it did not help. All the coldness and darkness and infinite loneliness of the world filled David's mind until it seemed ready to burst. Then he knew no more. And so the days passed. David lost count of them, for it was dark all the time and there was nothing to distinguish day from night. Once when he woke up, he picked up the strange bottle by mistake for his own, and after he took a drink from it every time, staying awake any longer grew too much for him, for he discovered that drinking from it soon made him feel sleepy. Tasted good too, a little strong perhaps, but not unpleasant, and then he could sleep a while longer. Sometimes he told himself that he had only to scramble over the door, open it up and go up the steps till he met someone, and all his troubles would be over. He wished desperately that he could stop being alive, but his feet would not budge. His legs refused to carry him the little distance that he had to go, and he could not give himself up. He wanted to do it, but his body would not take him. When at last he was discovered, he was taken completely by surprise. He woke up to hear a voice just above his head saying, "Mamma mia, what are you doing here?" David jumped up like lightning, but made no attempt to run. The man had very black hair, like all Italians. Nothing, David answered in Italian. The sailor opened his mouth to shout, but thought better of it, and instead scrambled over to the door and shut it. Then he came back. He was not sure why he did this. Perhaps because the boy was so quiet, a very thin, very dirty boy who stood still as death and who had the calmest face he had ever seen. He ought to call someone and get the boy hauled up into the light of day. Then, by the light of his torch, he looked down into the boy's strange dark eyes and knew that he could not. Because that was just what those eyes expected him to do. The Italian sailor tried to shake off the feeling that the boy was going to die. His grandmother's eyes had looked like that the day before she died, but he might be wrong, of course. For one thing, his grandmother's eyes had been brown, and these boys were, well, it wasn't easy to see in that dim light. Very dark grey, perhaps, or green. So he said the first thing that entered his head, "Have you been drinking my wine?" "Yes, I'd no more water in my bottle. I didn't know it was wine. Thank you." The Italian shook his curly black head. Never had he met such a child. First he swigs my wine without knowing what it is, and then he thanks me for it as if it wasn't sheer robbery. And he was so quiet. A boy caught when he was up to mischief usually made off as fast as his legs would carry him, turned and twisted and looked all around for a way of escape. He just did not stand still and look at you in the face. "Where did you think you'd get to?" he asked helplessly. "To Italy?" Well, I suppose I shall have to hand you over to the captain." But the Italian knew very well that he would not be able to. "I don't think you're all there," he said. He dare not lay a hand on him. He could not bring himself to do it. "On the other hand, we shall be in Salerno this evening. It's hardly worth the trouble of dragging you along to the captain and having all the fuss. You can jump overboard just before we get in, and then I shan't have to have anything to do with it. I'll see about getting you out of here." "I can't swim," the boy said quietly. "Oh, mamma mia, then you aren't all there. I won't have anything to do with it. I'll give you a lifebelt and you must try and drift ashore." "Thank you." The Italian went away, shaking his head. David slept no more. He was hungry, but then he'd been hungry the last 4 times he'd wakened, and he'd run out of food. That was a strange man. It was really kind of him not to let the captain arrest him. He could not know that David was so tired he could hardly hold out any longer. And now he must take to the water. He didn't know anything about lifebelts, but the Italian seemed to think he could drift ashore in one. So perhaps he would run on his way for yet another night, perhaps several nights before they finally caught up with him. But although David felt certain he knew what the end would be, his body set about getting him ready. Automatically, he stuffed his ragged shirt into his no less ragged trousers, tied his bundle securely, and sat down to wait. It was some time before the man returned. When he did come, David made no move. Perhaps the sailor had had second thoughts about the lifebelt, but David was beyond caring. The Italian had brought the lifebelt, however, and a piece of bread as well. David ate half of it on the spot, while the man was showing him how to use his arms to make sure he drifted in the right direction. David watched and realised he would almost be up to his neck in water. He frowned. The talk about direction had put him in mind of his compass. Suppose getting wet were bad for it. He'd better tie his bundle around his neck like that. The man lowered him over the side of the ship on the end of a rope and told him not to splash about in the water until the ship was some way off. Otherwise he might be heard. The water was not particularly cold. David looked back at the ship as it sailed swiftly on. For a moment he thought he was going to drown. It might very well be an easy way of sending people off to their death, a belt like that. It looked like a car tyre, he thought, but he did not drown. He found it was not even necessary to fling his arms about as he had been told to, for the ship had created a strong wash that drove him nearer and nearer to the dark line of the coast. But before long David realised it was not quite so easy. Several hours passed before he touched land, and by that time he was so cold it might have been the depth of water, and so exhausted he was, quite incapable of feeling. Only his feet had the will to carry him further. David stumbled, staggered, crawled onwards in the darkness, uphill all the time, the going hard and stony. It must be a mountain slope. Then he came to a road and staggered across it without even remembering to see if there were people about. Then further uphill there was something growing in low, straight lines. Then another stretch of mountainside with hard, sharp-edged stones that hurt his feet, and he could go no further. We'll leave it there.